At first, the reports did not sound like warnings. They read more like observations, dry, methodical, and restrained in tone, written in the language of military routine rather than urgency. Filed by officers at the front and passed upward through command channels, they described British movements in terms that seemed almost familiar. Patrol activity, artillery adjustments, infantry probes. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Certainly nothing that suggested a shift in the balance of the battlefield. But beneath that surface, something had already begun to change. Because what the reports described was not what British forces were doing, but how they were doing it. In the early stages of the war, the German command had developed a relatively clear understanding of their primary opponents. French doctrine had been predictable. Polish resistance had been brave but structured in ways that could be broken through speed and concentration. Even in the early encounters with British forces in France, there had been a sense of familiarity, of conventional movement, defined front lines, and engagements that followed recognizable patterns. But after 1940, particularly following the evacuation from Dunkirk, something began to shift within British military behavior. It was not immediate. It was not dramatic. And that was precisely why it was difficult to identify at first. British forces did not suddenly become more aggressive. They did not launch large, decisive offensives that forced German units to react instantly. Instead, they began to operate differently at the edges of the battlefield, in ways that were harder to define, harder to predict, and increasingly harder to counter. The first signs appeared in nighttime reports. German sentries along defensive positions began noting increased movement after dark. Not large-scale assaults, not coordinated attacks, but small, precise incursions. Patrols that moved quietly through gaps in the line, sometimes engaging, sometimes observing, sometimes disappearing without leaving a clear trace of their purpose. At first, these were dismissed as routine reconnaissance. Every army conducted patrols. Every army probed enemy positions under cover of darkness. But these were different, because they were not isolated. They were consistent, and they were purposeful. A report from a German infantry unit stationed along a quiet sector in Western Europe described it in simple terms. Enemy activity during night hours has increased. Patrols approach positions without engaging, withdraw before response can be organized. Purpose unclear. At the time, the wording reflected uncertainty, but not concern. That would come later, because what the report did not yet recognize was that these actions were not meant to achieve immediate results. They were meant to create a pattern, one that would gradually reshape how the German forces experienced the battlefield. Over time, the reports began to accumulate. Different units, different locations, similar observations. British forces were not behaving unpredictably in a chaotic sense. They were behaving unpredictably in a controlled, deliberate way. Their movements did not follow a fixed rhythm. Their engagements did not always seek decisive outcomes. And their presence was felt even when no direct attack occurred. German officers began to notice something else. Fatigue. Not physical exhaustion alone, but something more subtle. Sentries reported increased tension during night hours. Units described difficulty maintaining consistent alertness over extended periods. The expectation of contact, without the certainty of when or where it would occur, began to wear on personnel in ways that traditional engagements did not. A battlefield where nothing happens can be managed. A battlefield where something might happen at any moment cannot. And that distinction began to appear in the language of the reports. Enemy patrols operate without a fixed schedule. Contact occurs intermittently, often without follow-up. Troops report difficulty identifying patterns of activity. Still, the tone remained controlled, professional, measured. But the frequency of such reports increased. And with frequency came recognition. British tactics were not focused solely on direct engagement. They were focused on presence, on disruption, on forcing the enemy to remain in a constant state of readiness without providing a clear point of decision. It was not yet seen as a threat, but it was no longer dismissed as routine. Further along the chain of command, analysts began comparing reports from multiple sectors. Patterns emerged, not in the actions themselves, but in their effects. Units exposed to sustained British night activity reported similar conditions regardless of location. Increased alert cycles, decreased rest efficiency, higher levels of uncertainty among lower-ranking personnel, and most importantly, a gradual shift in how those units perceived the battlefield. The British were not simply opposing them. They were influencing them. That realization did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, through repetition, through observation, through the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details that, when viewed together, suggested something more deliberate at work. And as that understanding began to take shape, the language of the report started to change. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough to be noticed, because what had once been described as activity was now being described as persistent pressure. What had once been patrol movement was now controlled engagement, and what had once been considered routine, it was beginning to be seen as intentional. The concern did not come from a single event. It did not come from a major battle or a decisive loss. It came from something far less visible. The realization that the enemy was shaping the conditions of the fight, without needing to win it outright. And that realization, once understood, could not be ignored, because it suggested something far more complex than simple opposition. It suggested adaptation. And adaptation in war is rarely visible until it has already begun to take effect. By the time the reports reached divisional and corps-level command, they were no longer being read as isolated field notes. They were being compared, cross-referenced, studied not for what they described individually, but for what they revealed collectively. And what they revealed was something that did not fit neatly into traditional categories of battlefield behavior. Because the British were not simply engaging differently. They were shaping the conditions under which engagement occurred. German staff officers began laying out reports from multiple sectors: France, North Africa, later Italy, and what stood out was not variation, but consistency in effect. Different terrain, different units, different operational circumstances, yet the same pattern appeared again and again. Intermittent pressure, unpredictable timing, limited engagement followed by withdrawal, and most importantly, no clear opportunity for decisive response. This was where the concern began to deepen, because conventional doctrine relied on understanding the enemy's intent well enough to counter it. Even an aggressive opponent could be analyzed, his objectives identified, his movements anticipated, his attacks absorbed or redirected. But what happens when the opponent does not present a clear objective? When pressure is applied without commitment? When contact occurs but does not develop? German officers began to phrase the problem differently in their internal summaries. The enemy avoids decisive engagement, yet maintains constant operational presence. It was not a complaint. It was a diagnosis. British forces were not failing to engage. They were choosing when not to, and that choice disrupted the very framework of German response. Because the response required clarity, and clarity was exactly what was being denied. A battalion commander along a quiet front might report 3 nights of minor activity. Small patrols, brief exchanges of fire, nothing significant. On the 4th night, nothing would happen at all. Then on the 5th, another probe, slightly deeper this time, testing a different section of the line. There was no rhythm, no escalation, no pattern that could be easily predicted. And because of that, every moment of quiet became suspect. German units began to extend their alert cycles. Sentries remained on edge longer than necessary. Reserves were kept closer to readiness positions. Officers hesitated to rotate troops out of forward lines for rest, uncertain whether a quiet period was genuine or simply part of the pattern. And over time, this began to produce measurable effects. Fatigue increased. Decision-making slowed. Reaction times became inconsistent. But the deeper impact was psychological, because the battlefield no longer followed expectations. In traditional engagements, tension builds toward an event, a known possibility of attack, a moment where pressure culminates in action. Even under heavy fire, there is a sense of structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But under these conditions, there was no clear beginning and no clear end. just continuous uncertainty. German reports began to reflect this more openly. Troops report difficulty maintaining alertness over extended periods without defined engagement. Enemy activity creates constant expectation of contact, reducing efficiency of rest cycles. Lack of identifiable pattern complicates defensive planning. Still measured, still controlled, but no longer neutral. The concern was not about being defeated in battle. It was about being worn down without one. This distinction became increasingly important as the war expanded into new theaters. In North Africa, British forces applied similar principles on a larger scale. Movement across the desert was not always aimed at direct confrontation. Instead, units maneuvered in ways that forced German commanders to react repeatedly, shifting positions, adjusting defenses, committing resources without ever being certain where the main effort would occur. Again, the reports followed the same pattern. The enemy demonstrates mobility without a clear objective. Frequent repositioning creates uncertainty regarding the main axis of advance. Enemy appears to test reactions rather than commit forces. To a traditional operational mindset, this was inefficient. Why move without striking? Why probe without following through? Why apply pressure without attempting a breakthrough? But that interpretation assumed the goal was immediate victory. And increasingly, German command began to suspect that it was not. Because the longer these patterns continued, the more they affected German operational stability. Decisions that should have been straightforward became delayed. Resources that should have been concentrated became dispersed. Commanders began to second-guess their own assessments, not because they lacked information, but because the information did not lead to clear conclusions. In one internal analysis, a staff officer summarized the issue with unusual clarity. The enemy's intent is not always to achieve immediate tactical success, but to influence our operational posture over time. That sentence marked a shift, because it acknowledged something beyond conventional engagement. It acknowledged that British tactics were not simply reactive or defensive. They were designed to create pressure without resolution, designed to force adaptation without providing clarity, designed to shape the enemy's behavior indirectly. And that realization carried implications that extended beyond any single sector. Because if the British were deliberately avoiding predictability, then traditional methods of anticipating their actions would fail. If they were deliberately controlling the tempo, then attempts to force engagement on German terms would become increasingly difficult. And if they were deliberately applying psychological pressure, then the battlefield itself was no longer defined solely by terrain and firepower. It was defined by perception, by expectation, by uncertainty. German reports began to reflect this more openly as the months progressed. Not in dramatic language, not in alarmist terms, but in the careful, deliberate way that military professionals record things they cannot yet fully counter. The enemy's actions appear limited in scale but cumulative in effect. Operational clarity reduced by irregular engagement patterns. Further analysis required. The concern was no longer about isolated tactics. It was about a system, a way of fighting that did not rely on decisive battles to achieve impact. And once that system was recognized, it became much harder to ignore, because it meant that even in the absence of major engagements, the balance of the battlefield could still be shifting. The first attempts to counter the pattern were straightforward. Increase patrols, strengthen night watch, respond more aggressively to any sign of British movement. At the level of doctrine, the solution seemed simple. If the enemy was applying intermittent pressure, then that pressure could be met with equal or greater force. If British patrols moved forward at night, German patrols would do the same. If contact occurred unpredictably, then readiness would be maintained continuously. On paper, it was a logical response. In practice, it created new problems. German frontline units began expanding their own patrol operations, pushing men forward into no man's land more frequently, attempting to intercept or disrupt British movements before they could develop. At first, this seemed to produce results. Occasional engagements occurred. Some patrols made contact. A few minor successes were reported. But the overall pattern did not change. Because British forces did not respond by increasing intensity. They responded by adjusting timing. Where German patrols pushed forward on one night, British patrols appeared on another. Where increased vigilance was maintained in one sector, activity shifted to a neighboring position. There was no fixed point of pressure, only movement, adaptation, and continued unpredictability. And so the German response began to stretch. More patrols required more manpower. More alert hours reduced available rest. More readiness meant less recovery. The system began to feed into itself. A company commander might increase night patrol frequency to counter British incursions, only to find that his men were more fatigued during the following days. That fatigue reduced efficiency during daylight operations, which in turn required additional caution, additional readiness, additional strain. The reports reflected this shift. Expanded patrol activity has not reduced enemy presence. Enemy continues to operate at times and locations not aligned with our patrol schedule. Increased strain on personnel noted. Still no alarm. But the tone was changing. Because the response was not producing control. It was producing pressure. And that pressure was cumulative. In some sectors, German units attempted a different approach, reducing reactive movement and instead focusing on static defense. Stronger fixed positions. Reinforced observation points. Clear fields of fire established to discourage infiltration. Again, the logic was sound. Deny access. Control the ground. Force the enemy to engage directly. But the British did not respond by attacking those positions. They bypassed them, or ignored them entirely. Reports began to describe a new pattern. Enemy patrols observed moving parallel to the defensive line, avoiding direct contact. Activity continues in adjacent sectors despite reinforced positions. Defensive strength in one area appears to shift enemy focus rather than reduce activity. This created a different kind of problem, because it meant that strengthening one position did not reduce overall pressure, it merely displaced it. And that displacement forced German units to remain flexible, to adjust repeatedly, to redistribute attention across a wider area than before. In effect, the battlefield expanded without changing physically. More space had to be watched. More directions had to be considered. More uncertainty had to be managed. At the same time, British forces continued to avoid large-scale engagement unless conditions favored them. When they did attack, it was often after periods of irregular activity, moments when German units had already been subjected to disrupted rest cycles, inconsistent patterns of contact, and prolonged tension without resolution. The timing was not accidental. It was selected, and that selection began to stand out in German analysis. Enemy engagements often occur following extended periods of low-level activity. Troop readiness appears reduced at point of contact. Timing of attack may be influenced by cumulative fatigue. This was the point where concern became more explicit, because the pattern was no longer just disruptive. It was preparatory. The British were not simply avoiding decisive battle. They were shaping the conditions before it occurred. And German units, despite their efforts to counter the pattern, were finding themselves reacting to it rather than controlling it. One battalion report described the effect in unusually direct terms. Enemy actions create continuous operational tension without a clear objective, resulting in decreased efficiency over time. That sentence was noted at higher levels, because it described something beyond tactics. It described a process, a way of applying pressure that did not rely on immediate results, but instead accumulated impact over extended periods. And once that process was recognized, the difficulty of countering it became clearer, because it could not be stopped by a single action, could not be defeated in a single engagement. It required adaptation at a structural level, and that kind of adaptation takes time that frontline units did not always have. As weeks turned into months, the reports began to include another recurring theme. Morale. Not collapse, not failure, but strain. Troops express increased difficulty maintaining focus during prolonged periods of irregular activity. Confidence in predicting enemy behavior is reduced. The need for rotation and rest is increasing. These were not dramatic statements. They were measured, professional. But they pointed to something that was becoming harder to ignore. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by firepower and position. It was shaped by rhythm, by timing, by the controlled application of uncertainty. And German units, trained for decisive engagement, structured for clear lines of action, were being forced into a different kind of fight. One where the enemy did not need to overwhelm them, only to outlast their ability to remain unaffected. And as that realization spread through the reports, the concern became less about individual actions and more about the system behind them. By the time the pattern reached army-level analysis, it could no longer be treated as a collection of local irregularities. It had to be defined, not just described, but understood in a way that allowed for response at scale. Staff officers began compiling extended summaries, drawing from months of reports across multiple fronts. What had once been noted as isolated behavior was now recognized as a consistent method, one that appeared in Western Europe, North Africa, and increasingly in Italy. Different terrain, different units, same underlying effect. And that consistency forced a shift in how British operations were categorized. They were no longer seen as passive or reactive. They were being interpreted as deliberately controlled. One internal memorandum framed it with unusual precision. The enemy employs limited tactical engagements to produce cumulative operational effects, with emphasis on disruption rather than immediate territorial gain. That phrasing mattered, because it moved the discussion out of the realm of small unit tactics and into something broader. Operational intent. The British were not simply reacting to German deployments. They were influencing them, and that influence extended beyond the front line. Because every adjustment made by German units in response to British activity had consequences further up the chain, on supply, on planning, on allocation of reserves. A division that maintained extended alert cycles required more rotation. Rotation required transport. Transport required fuel. Fuel required prioritization. And prioritization required decisions. Each small adjustment created another. Each reaction expanded into something larger. And all of it was driven not by major offensives, but by controlled, persistent pressure applied at the tactical level. The German command began to recognize a problem that was difficult to address directly. They could defeat British units in battle. They could hold positions. They could repel attacks. But they were finding it harder to maintain efficiency under sustained conditions of irregular engagement. And efficiency in a prolonged conflict was as important as victory in any single engagement. Reports began to include comparisons. Units operating in sectors with minimal British activity showed higher consistency in performance. More stable rest cycles, clearer operational planning, fewer disruptions. Units exposed to sustained British tactical patterns showed the opposite. Increased variability, greater strain, more frequent adjustments, and critically, less predictability in their own operations. That last point became central to the concern. Because unpredictability is manageable when it belongs to the enemy. It becomes dangerous when it begins to affect your own system. One staff officer summarized it in a way that circulated widely among command circles. The enemy's irregularity forces our regularity to become reactive. That was the core issue. German doctrine relied on structure, clear chains of command, defined operational phases, coordinated movement based on established principles. British tactics were not breaking that structure directly. They were forcing it to adapt constantly. And constant adaptation without clear direction leads to inefficiency. Attempts were made to formalize countermeasures, standardized patrol schedules, defined alert rotations, clear thresholds for response. The goal was to restore predictability, to impose structure back onto the battlefield. But the British approach did not confront structure head-on. It moved around it. If patrols were scheduled, activity shifted outside those windows. If alert rotations were standardized, pressure was applied during transition periods. If response thresholds were defined, actions were taken just below them. The pattern was not rigid. It was adaptive, and that adaptability made it resistant to fixed countermeasures. German reports began to reflect a growing level of analytical concern. Not panic, not alarm, but a recognition that the problem was not easily solvable through conventional means. Enemy actions remain below the threshold of decisive engagement while maintaining continuous influence. Countermeasures produce localized improvement, but do not reduce overall effect. Further study required to determine long-term implications. That last phrase, long-term implications, began to appear more frequently. Because the issue was no longer immediate. It was cumulative. What would happen if this pattern continued over months? Over years? What would be the effect on unit cohesion? On operational planning? On the ability to sustain prolonged engagement under conditions of constant uncertainty? These questions did not have immediate answers, but they were being asked. And the fact that they were being asked at all marked a shift. Because it meant that British tactics were no longer being evaluated purely in terms of battlefield outcomes. They were being evaluated in terms of systemic impact. And that is where the concern deepened. Because systemic impact is harder to counter than direct threat. You cannot simply attack it. You cannot simply defend against it. You have to adapt your entire structure to account for it. And that kind of adaptation requires time, coordination, and clarity, all of which were being affected by the very tactics in question. By this stage, the tone of the reports had changed. Still controlled. Still professional. But no longer neutral. British tactics were being described as effective not because of their scale, but because of their consistency, their persistence, their ability to influence conditions without requiring decisive engagement. And once that was understood, the concern was no longer about what the British were doing in any single moment. It was about what their method was doing over time, because a battlefield shaped gradually can produce outcomes that are not immediately visible. But once they appear, they are often difficult to reverse. By the later stages of the war, the reports no longer asked what the British were doing. They focused on what had already been done, not in terms of territory gained or battles won, but in the quieter, more difficult-to-measure changes that had taken place within German units over time. The accumulation of irregular pressure, the constant adjustment to unpredictable movement, the prolonged strain of operating without clear patterns. These had not produced a single moment of collapse. They had produced something else. Erosion. Not visible from a distance. Not dramatic in any one report, but present in the gradual shift of language, tone, and expectation across the entire system. Where earlier reports had described activity, later ones described condition. Where earlier assessments focused on enemy movement, later ones focused on internal impact. Operational efficiency reduced under sustained irregular engagement. Troop readiness increasingly dependent on rotation and recovery cycles. Predictive assessment of enemy intent remains limited. The phrasing remained controlled, measured, but the meaning was clear. The battlefield had changed, not in structure, not in geography, but in experience. German units were still capable, still disciplined, still able to fight, to hold, to respond when required. But they were doing so under conditions that had been shaped over time by an opponent who did not rely solely on decisive moments to create advantage. Instead, the advantage had been built gradually, through repetition, through persistence, through the careful application of pressure that rarely demanded immediate results, but consistently influenced the environment in which results would later be decided. By this stage, attempts to counter the pattern had evolved as well. German command had refined its responses, improved coordination, and adjusted certain aspects of operational behavior to mitigate the effects. Rotations were managed more carefully. Alert cycles were modified. Greater emphasis was placed on maintaining flexibility in response. But these adjustments came at a cost. They required resources, time, tension, and in a war that was already stretching those elements to their limits, every additional demand mattered. Because while the British method did not always produce immediate gains, it forced continuous investment from the German side simply to maintain equilibrium. And equilibrium in prolonged conflict is rarely sustainable without consequence. In one of the later analytical summaries, the issue was framed with a clarity that reflected months, if not years, of accumulated observation. The enemy's tactical approach reduces our ability to operate under stable conditions, requiring continuous adaptation and increasing strain on personnel and command structures. That statement did not describe defeat. It described pressure, sustained, unresolved, and deeply integrated into the experience of the war. On the ground, that pressure translated into small, persistent changes. A sentry who no longer trusted a quiet night. An officer who hesitated before committing reserves, uncertain whether the current engagement was the main effort or another probe. A unit that required longer recovery after periods of irregular contact. None of these were decisive on their own, but together they altered how the battlefield was lived, how decisions were made, how energy was spent, and how long that energy could be sustained. Because war is not only fought through force, it is endured through systems, through routines, through the ability to maintain structure under stress. And what British tactics had done, gradually, deliberately, was place that structure under continuous strain without offering a clear point at which it could be restored. The German reports reflected that reality not through dramatic language, but through consistency. The same observations, repeated, refined, expanded, until they formed a pattern of their own. A pattern not of enemy movement but of internal response. And that pattern revealed something that had not been fully understood at the beginning. That control of the battlefield does not always belong to the side that attacks most forcefully. Sometimes it belongs to the side that determines how the battle is experienced. When it happens, how often it happens, and under what conditions it must be endured. By the end, the concern recorded in those reports was no longer about isolated tactics. It was about the recognition that the nature of the fight itself had shifted, that the enemy had found a way to apply influence without requiring constant engagement, and that this influence, once established, was difficult to remove, because it existed not only in movement and action, but in expectation, in perception, in the constant awareness that at any moment something might happen, and that not knowing when was part of the pressure itself. The battlefield, in that sense, had expanded beyond terrain. It had extended into time, into rhythm, into the unseen spaces between engagements where decisions were made, rest was attempted, and readiness was maintained. And within those spaces, British tactics had taken hold. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently enough that, over time, they became impossible to ignore.